Are they in? Okay, welcome everyone to today's Friday seminar, which is the last of this term series. So we'll have a pause for a month and then kick off again in early May. I think the next one in early May is Emma Maris on rewilding souls and animal ethics, the philosophy of conservation. So that's I can't remember the exact date, but it's in early May, that one, and then we'll have a range after that as well. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So Sandra Diaz is Professor of Ecology at Cordoba National University in Argentina, and she's also a visiting professor in this department here as well. And on one side, she's an accomplished ecologist with a particular focus on plant functional traits and syndromes and their effects on ecosystem properties and their interactions on global change drivers. She founded the Nucleodiversis on Diversity and Sustainability and co-founded the Global Communal Plant Trait Initiative, TRI. But also, yeah, on the other side of Sandra, she's also very actively engaged in the shaping of biodiversity policy at an international level. And she co-chaired the global assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and coordinated the scientific contributions to the Convention of Biological Diversity, Global Biodiversity Framework, which is what she'll talk about today. And there's a whole range of accolades. I won't go through them all, but amongst the things she's a member of the Academies of Sciences of Argentina, the USA, France, Norway, Latin America, and the developing world. And she's a foreign member of the Royal Society and a member of the American Philosophical Society. And there's a whole range of awards. The most recent of which I was with her in Edinburgh a few days ago, and Nicola Sturgeon presented to her with the Royal Botanical Gardens of Edinburgh medal for this year as well. So it's a great pleasure to have you. Thank you for coming and joining us and sharing your insights. Over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me well at the back? Okay. It's always a great pleasure to be back in Oxford. And thank you, Jadinder, for the very generous presentation, and to you and the whole of the Oxford Biodiversity Network for the invitation to this talk. Today, I will talk about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is a policy instrument that came into force less than 3 months ago. It was approved by all the parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which means the vast majority of the countries in the world, and is going to structure all the policy action on biodiversity at the global scale in at least the next 10 years. So it's bound to have massive influence on what gets done and doesn't get done about nature and people. Now, before I go any further, I thought you would be interested in knowing that I'm not a policy expert. I am an academic with strong interest in fundamental ecology, and I got involved in the biodiversity science policy interface almost reluctantly as a consequence of my leadership of the IPBES global assessment. IPBES is, of course, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The global assessment, as some of you may know, is the first intergovernmental and most comprehensive ever stock taking of nature, what it means to us, and what we have been doing with it and to it in the past 50 years, and with a projection to the next 30 or 50 years. Now, the global assessment was designed and timed to be the major scientific consensus input into the global biodiversity framework. What happens is that the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, has this long-term vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. And each decade, it produces a new reincarnation of the practical steps to actually get there. The previous incarnation was the Aichi Targets, which expired in 2020. And the new incarnation was going to be the Global Biodiversity Framework. So the role of IBIS was to provide this framework with the scientific scaffolding, with the technical details, and with the teeth. Now, the process by which a scientifically led finding gets into the CBD process and ends up being or not being in an instrument that is enforced is complex and intricate. So what I am going to try now is to talk about the text itself of the Global Biodiversity Framework, but also a little bit of a testimony of the intricate process that takes to it. As I said, it is intricate, so I thought the timeline would help. As early as 2019, the CBD created something called the Open-Ended Working Group. And the role of the Open-Ended Working Group was to come up with a draft of the text of the Global Biodiversity Framework. They had to produce a zero draft that was offered to a very wide range of communities for feedback. And after many iterations, they produced the first draft that was offered to the parties of the convention, which are the only ones with voting rights, so that the text would be more or less in shape to go through the word by word scrutiny and consensus approval that had to happen in the COP15 plenary. Also in 2019, after 3 years of hectic work, we managed to deliver the global assessment in time and in shape to serve as input to some major products and processes that the CBD had scheduled for 2020. One of these major products was the CBD's own assessment of whether the Aichi targets were met or not. The conclusion that was that none of the 20 targets were met. And there were a number of events that needed to happen in 2020, including COP15. But then, of course, COVID-19 pandemic happened, and the whole year of biodiversity went to hell. Now, with all its tragic consequences, this gave extra time to the scientific community to keep producing advice to the Global Biodiversity Framework. This was, for example, a paper I led, but there are many others, all really targeted to provide useful input directly to the GBF. The advice from the scientific community was unprecedented in its amount, in its degree of detail, in its coordination, and also in the convergence of the recommendations we all gave. If I have to distill this consensus advice, I would probably take these 4 points. First, the Global Biodiversity Framework needed to be as inclusive as possible of a broad range of disciplines, knowledge systems, stakeholders, and values. Part of the failure of previous policy instruments was due to the fact that the epistemological framing and the set of actors involved were simply too narrow. In this sense, IBES contributed a highly inclusive conceptual framework, embracing different disciplines, knowledge systems, stakeholders, and with an unprecedented participation of indigenous peoples and local communities, interests, perspectives, and knowledge. And contribution, the key concepts of nature, nature's contributions to people, and good quality of life. In particular, nature's contributions to people was a transformative concept, which simply means all the good things and bad things that we get from nature and with nature. It explicitly includes ecosystem services, but is much wider, much more inclusive, because it also embraces other ways of conceiving our relationship with nature. Another consensus recommendation to the GBF was the need to embrace the multidimensionality of biodiversity. So thinking not only of the facet of ecosystems, but also species, genetic diversity, populations, and not just wild diversity, domesticated diversity as well. Now, why this recommendation? This was because when building momentum for COP15, there was this push for trying to capture the whole of diversity in one single apex target, one single number, trying to imitate the iconic apex targets of 1.5 degrees for climate. And there was also a push for that apex targets to be the 30 by 30 target for natural ecosystems. To use this 30 by 30 target as the sole target encapsulating the whole of biodiversity. And obviously, the rallying power of a single, catchy, easy to understand and to communicate and to remember number is undeniable. But unlike molecules of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causing the greenhouse effect, every organism is slightly different from other organisms, and they are very badly mixed. Some of them are locally much more common and globally much more abundant, actually, and locally much more common than others. And the different phenotypic characteristics make some of these organisms much more vulnerable to our activities than others. So all this multidimensionality of biodiversity make it not very amenable to the simple single targets that capture the public imagination. So we advise against it. Instead, we showed that the different facets of biodiversity are, of course, interrelated, but none of them is neatly nested within the other like Russian dolls. So protecting one of them helps with the other, but it's not enough. None of the facets can really be an umbrella for all the others. Each of the facets needs specific targets with specific indicators and actions. Another consensus recommendation was about the formal protection of the most pristine ecosystems. If one of the Aichi targets was close to being achieved, was the one about the 70% of the land area under formal protection. And yet biodiversity kept going down. So obviously the area under formal protection is not the only consideration. Things like where it is located, how it's governed, and how it's monitored, and to what degree the rights of indigenous peoples and local dwellers are respected are all critical factors. And even when all this is respected, and no matter how much effort one does, pristine ecosystems are always going to be a minority of the land area. The vast majority of the earth is always going to be working landscapes and cities and towns. So looking after nature and nature's contributions to people in human landscapes is also very important for a number of reasons. There is, of course, the fact that these bits of wild nature interspersed with farms and interspersed with cities and towns are often composed by not terribly endangered and not terribly endemic or unique species, but they are very useful as stepping stones or corridors between areas of higher conservation value. But on top of that, many nature's contributions to people are delivered only in proximity. So the microclimate regulation benefits, the water and air filtering benefits, the pollination benefits, the multiple physical and psychological health benefits of which Kathy Willis gave such a wonderful talk recently, all of these benefits are only materialized if the bit that provides them is within or very close to the places where people live and work every day, even if these bits of nature are not particularly endangered or unique. And another important thing is that this is the kind of landscapes in which most people get in touch with the rest of the living and learns to appreciate them and care for them. Not everybody has the luxury of going to some fancy remote national park to admire nature and learn to love it. Most people need bits of nature, however humble, on their doorsteps. And increasingly, people around the world are claiming the right to have them. Another consensus recommendation to the GBF was that the targets needed to be bold, quantitative, time-bound, and associated with precise but feasible indicators. And finally, and perhaps most crucially, the GBF needed to seek transformative change. So action has to happen at the level of nature protection, yes, but also needs to tackle the direct drivers or immediate causes of nature's decline. And most crucially, we need to deal with the root causes, the indirect drivers of nature decline, which are all social and economic and political in nature. I'm talking here basically of the ways we consume and trade and allocate cost and benefits and allocate safeguards, incentives, subsidies, carrots and sticks. Okay, the first draft of the GBF 2021 have incorporated most, if not all, of these considerations. Never before the scientific community got our act together to such a degree. Never before the CBD listened to the scientific advice so carefully. So we were all very excited about this draft. So in the timeline, we are here at the point of the first draft. But then the square brackets started to encroach. Now, square brackets in the policy world indicate bits of text that are not yet agreed by the parties. And as the country started to go in detail through the text of the GBF, these brackets started to proliferate, and they formed a thicket so thick that smothered the whole text to the point of becoming unreadable. This is an example, right? This paragraph is not the worst. So you have an idea of what I mean, smothered by square brackets. So when the crucial segment of the COP15 finally took place, that was in Montreal in 22, in Canada, of course, but still under the presidency of China, we had this almost unworkable draft. It was also shortly after the climate COP27 that hadn't gone terribly well. So the atmosphere was not a brave optimist, precisely. It happened in the middle of strong regional political tensions with global implications. And the COP was juggled by two countries that were not precisely in the best of terms, that have very different negotiation styles, that coexisted but didn't mix under the same roof of the Montreal Convention Center. And the tensions between developed and developing countries were rife during the whole meeting until the very end day and in the very last session. So with all this considering, as you may imagine, the expectations were not great. Maybe because of that, I think the outcome of COP15 is positive. Now let me do a little bit of a stock taking of the good things and bad things of the GBF and the role that narratives played in all this. First, the good. I think it was very good that governments embraced the recommendation by scientists and considered the multidimensionality of nature and kept distinct outcomes for ecosystems, yes, but also for species, populations, and genetic diversity. It was very good. It is also very good that in the targets that deal with species have shifted the focus from just concentrating on threatened species towards decreasing the overall extinction rate and risk, including a quantitative target of decreasing the extinction rate by tenfold by 2050. This is important because if all the attention was kept on threatened species only, one can think of a hypothetical perverse scenario in which all the energy is spent in keeping the species just not going over the brink, right? Just to make sure they don't go extinct. But so we can tick the box, but simultaneously more and more species get really close to the brink. So that's why this shift is important. also very, very good is the explicit recognition of genetic diversity, not only of wild organisms, but also domesticated organisms. In particular, all the hundreds of thousands of forms and varieties and phenotypes of organisms maintained over the centuries by indigenous peoples and local communities, many of which are endangered. And it's also good that there is a specific reference to in situ conservation, that means that the organisms are kept in the ecosystem where they can keep evolving under the stewardship of their traditional creators, as well as, of course, conserved in ex situ facilities. Regarding the highly visible targets of 30 by 30 by 30, restoration and protection targets regarding pristine ecosystems, they were kept. The 30% percentages were kept, but with very strong, prominent, explicit mention to the need to respect the stewardship and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. So that's it's a good thing. And one thing which may look like a little, but is not. The near zero loss by 2030 is just loss and not net loss, as it was discussed previously. I think that having net loss would have opened a whole complicated can of worms. So it's good that it's just loss, full stop. And of course, it's excellent that one of the big overall goals and at least 3 targets deal with the human landscapes. For all the reasons I just explained, I think this is quite important and gives a lot of room for transformative action. And finally, it's excellent that the GBF has explicit targets for all 5 major drivers of biodiversity loss at the global scale identified by IBIS: land and sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. Even better is the fact that most of the root causes, the indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, are all explicitly addressed with their specific targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework. There is target 14 on multiple values of nature, their mainstreaming in the whole of society. There is target 18 about subsidies to activities harmful to nature. Although countries are going to take 5 years to identify which are these harmful subsidies, I think that was clear enough in the first draft. And there are specific targets about the private sector and lifestyle choices. Although if you ask me, I think they are treated with kid gloves as compared to the formulation in the first draft. Okay, that was the good. Now the bad. I don't want to bore you to death with all the details that went wrong, especially because they all went wrong more or less in the same direction. Targets that in the first draft were full of teeth, in the sense of being scientifically based, quantitative, with clear timelines, with clear indicators, were deleted, but most commonly they were just diluted and surrendered by padding language. I think an example is more eloquent than any explanation. Here is target 7 about pollution, and this is the first draft version, the one we liked, and this is the definite version. And in each case, I painted with the same color, the same keyword before and after transformation. So maybe now you can understand better what I mean when I say a target made toothless by dilution and by insertion of padding language. And these are the vast majority of the quantitative targets that survived in the Global Biodiversity Framework. You can see very few. Now, one may ask them, how much better is the Global Biodiversity Framework as compared to the Aichi targets that were declared failed in 2020? I have this incredibly long and boring table comparing them carefully, and I can give it to any one of you who is interested, but just a quick summary. About 45% of the targets show significant improvement in the GBF as compared to the Aichi targets. And 30% shows a slight improvement, and the rest were either mixed or didn't change at all. So I would call this situation patchily positive. And if you are a glass half full sort of person, you can clearly call this a step forward. Now, probably the most interesting part of the process that led to the GBF and the best part of the GBF had to do with narratives. The GBF embraced the inclusive conceptual framework of IBIS with nature's contributions to people and good quality of life. As I explained, this was the result of a very long and very participatory co-construction, therefore was really much more inclusive than any previous instrument before. And the adoption of this by the Global Biodiversity Framework makes this framework more inclusive than any previous international biodiversity policy documents. But this wasn't an easy battle. Right from the beginning of the open-ended group all the way to the last days of COP15, there were repeated attempts to revert back to narrower categories without giving any scientific explanation. A similar example of narratives playing in the construction of the Global Biodiversity Framework is nature-based solution. Nature-based solution survived COP15 narrowly, but it did. And I think this survival was to a great proportion thanks to the excellent work by nature-based solution advocates such as Cécile Girardin and Nat Seddon and many other colleagues. They did an excellent work in explaining in their papers and in also public presentations what it is that MBS are and what MBS are not. And that helped dispelling a lot of fear and distrust by a number of social actors, which, by the way, were different from the social actors that resisted the IBES conceptual framework. In this case, the main resistance came from the indigenous peoples' organizations. But in the end, both of these potentially transformative new concepts are enshrined in the Global Biodiversity Framework, which I think is very good. The GBF also has, as I said, an unprecedented prominence of human rights, which is new in international environmental policy instruments. They fully recognize human rights such as, to a large degree, gender rights, also the rights of vulnerable minorities, and the human rights and the rights to land and to customary use by indigenous peoples. This means that the game now is not only about biology, is not only about economics, it is of course about trade-offs and efficiency curves, but now increasingly is also about red lines, safeguards, and it's about legislation. The narrative has changed dramatically. It's a completely different game. You may argue whether it's good or bad, but it's a completely different one. So again, an example of the battle of narratives in the context of the construction of the Global Biodiversity Framework. But of course, metaphors alone, narratives alone, don't change the world. But as a natural scientist, working with social scientists and other stakeholders, I learned not to underestimate, the importance of narratives and metaphors and storylines and their use. This is because, depending on your metaphors, you shed light or cast shade on different aspects of reality, which lead to different actions. And the metaphors not only anchor the mind, they also anchor the heart, and many, many actions on environmental policy and other things are not only the result of careful, rational, and quantitative analysis, come from the guts and the hearts of the people involved. So, the Global Biodiversity Framework is, it falls far short from the massive quantum leap we needed for ensuring a better future for all life on Earth using the narrative of the COP15. It's not transformative enough. It's a step in the right direction, but it's an incremental step. But considering how things look like in the past 2 years and in the past 2 months, actually, I would say this is a precious step. It's like the first mile in an expedition to Mount Everest with a very broad but basically correct map in one's hand. It's much better than just sitting and moaning at the train station. It's much better than a step in the wrong direction with the wrong map. But one has to be aware of what it is that is ahead. So wrapping up, as I just said, the Global Biodiversity Framework is mostly incremental, doesn't ensure transformative change, and gives a lot of wiggle room for those that pretend to change but want to keep doing the same. But at the same time, it's all what we have, really, and it's all we are going to have in the next at least 10 years. And in my view, because of its inclusive framing, this innovative concept it contains, I would say it provides a good general context for those who do want a change. It provides plenty of useful nails on which one can hook some transformative actions all the way from really local to global. Now, whether this is going to be yet another failure or is going to be an instrument for true change will ultimately depend on the quality of the implementation. The framework is just a framework. And this quality of the implementation will depend on the agency and the determination of those who are going to make it happen. In this sense, I think that the next couple of miles on the route to Mount Everest is the implementation phase, which has already started. And is going to need massive wisdom, massive knowledge, and massive generosity and energy, which I hope many of you will be happy to provide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandra. A fascinating and really concise overview of the wins and losses in that process. So we'll open up to questions. Also for those online, we're not taking live questions online, but pop your questions into the chat and then we'll relay those across to Sandra. Just to kick off, Sandra, I was wondering, when we look at the climate change convention, there's a whole architecture following the conventions about checking in on progress and reporting back and things. Is some sort of post-framework architecture also already proposed or being developed in terms of how we actually monitor how this framework is achieving its goals?
Yes, indeed. Countries are all committed to different working groups organized by the CBD and by the national focal points, and with a lot of collaboration by the big NGOs, EUCN, that kind of NGOs, which are working on what would be the best indicators for each of these targets, what would be they have a first order, second order, third order indicators, and how they are going to be monitored. And of course, there's a lot of tension because, of course, the best indicators are not feasible all over the world. So if you want to do something in a uniform way all over the planet, you need to be realistic and not very ambitious. And you need indicators that don't cheat, right? That's the key thing. Because you can find really insensitive indicators that make the countries look good. So normally policymakers like those, but they are not the best ones. For example, a classical example, number of hectares formally protected is a really bad indicator of how biodiversity is going. Because we know that biodiversity can go this way, whereas the number of hectares protected go this way. So that's the kind of indicators we have to fight against and find really good ones. I think with all the technology we have now, there's a lot of room.
And is there a timeline for these indicators to be developed? Is that
yes, but I don't have that at tip on my fingertips. Right. I think they're starting now. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Can I suggest also you stay in front of the camera so for the people online?
I'm sorry. Sorry, I tend to move too much.
Kathy, I'll ask you a question. Sorry, we'll take for the online audience. Press the screen share as well. Yep.
So Sandra, can you hear? Is this working? Yeah. Sandra, that was fantastic. Thank you. Really, really clear. Sort of partly a pointer, partly a question, I think I'm going to ask. So for me, biodiversity conservation, if you looked at it as an experiment, you'd say it's an experiment that's failed. We've had 30, 40 years of conservation practices coming through time and again, and we see more and more declines. And the point you just made about the number of protected areas is not a good indication of number of protected number of species. The thing that got dropped from the original draft, which I thought, oh, maybe it wasn't in there, was the whole question of connectivity. And I think you made a very good point at the beginning about actually nature needs to be near people and it needs to be connected. And what I see in the UK in terms of our policy development are both of those things are getting lost when you get down to the national and local level. We're still focusing on the small protected areas with no thought about how you connect them up across the landscape. And actually, if that protected area or that biodiversity is near to a building site or a new development, it's okay, you can pick the biodiversity up and move it elsewhere. And it's losing sight of the very big international framing that I think is needed if we really are going to turn this around. So I just wondered if you could comment on those two.
Yes, well, I am convinced that we really need all these connectivity bits and all these bits close to people. The evidence is very good. There's also evidence that the agricultural losses for keeping these bits of nature in the landscapes are either very small or their benefits. There is a great work by Lucas Garibaldi, for example, proving that up to 20% of the surface of agricultural land devoted to just wild, weedy bits of nature, it's actually neutral or is a benefit for agriculture because of the natural enemies and pollinators. So that's part of the detail we had in the first draft.
Yeah.
We also have in the first draft quantitative suggestions for including nature in cities, right? Using the examples, so I think it's Singapore and other cities that make that, okay, nobody has to be more than 10 minutes away from a green space, things like that. It was all there, but the countries killed it. They kept that the fact that it has to be in urban areas, but didn't want to give a specific number. So we are getting there, but to my taste, too slowly.
And do you think we should reintroduce those things then? I mean, is that how to move this on?
Okay, we cannot reintroduce them in the Global Biodiversity Framework. This is set in stone until for 10 years. But this is where I think that we can hook ourselves on the target and say, look, it's in the target, and start local or regional action and actually defending those bits and nurture those bits.
I'll alternate between online and offline. So one from online from Junchen Kao. Can you elaborate on when you say the 30 by 30 target is backed by science? Could you explain how target is perceived to be based on science? It says from their personal research, I think that they read that this is just a milestone to protect half the Earth's terrestrial and marine species.
I don't remember having said explicitly that was a target strongly, that the 30% and not 50 or not 20 was strongly backed up by science. I mean, it was debatable. If you remember when half Earth was proposed, it was highly debatable, but it was there. Everybody agrees that trying to protect the last sort of pristine ecosystems is a good thing. So that was, in a way, recommended. But our advice was, okay, consider very strongly that you need to know where they are located. Otherwise, the extra benefits is not going to be very good. I mean, if you create a bunch of new protected areas in land which is the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, it's all this area nobody wants, it's not going to be developed anyway. So let's make a protected area. The biodiversity benefits are not as good as if you put it in a place which is really in danger of being destroyed. So that's one thing. And of course, as I said, the consideration of connectivity between areas and the strong consideration of rights. I don't think today you can just declare a protected area without consulting people.
Thank you. And Audrey?
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is, what do you think the focus and priorities should be for academics and perhaps the University of Oxford in the lead up to COP16? What should we kind of be working for the next biodiversity COP?
Oh, I wouldn't dare saying what would be the priorities for the University of Oxford, really. Okay. In the GBF itself, there's a lot of exploration of how to do things better. For example, how to best build these bits of nature interspersed in our landscapes is huge. Another topic in which a bunch of us is working is to say, okay, if we cannot possibly save every species on Earth, I know this is extremely controversial, but if all the scenarios show that there's no way we are going to save all, maybe we can manage to save all the mammals and all the birds, right? Maybe, but definitely not, not all these obscure creatures that crawl around the world, right? So if there's no hope of saving all of them, should we identify critical priorities that absolutely have to be saved or not? So that's another very controversial, scientifically really interesting question. Critical species, critical ecosystems, critical functional groups that need to be saved. So that's to me a priority. Another one is all this mainstreaming, all really incorporating nature in everything we do. It's easy to say, but when you go to the practicalities, it's actually really, really tough. So I can see that transdisciplinary groups should have to work on that and work out the best practical solutions. So if people are really convinced but want a workable everyday life, what they should be doing.
I'll take another one from online from Connie McDermott. It says, can you say a few words about how Indigenous and local knowledge were integrated into the Global Biodiversity Framework, and to what role these other forms of knowledge might play in assessing progress towards quantitative targets?
Right, thank you. We did it in a number of ways. We opened the call to as many indigenous scholars as possible. When we opened the applications for potential expert, we really strongly encourage indigenous scholars. We didn't get very many, but try to get in touch with them anyway. We got in touch with anthropologists and ethnographers, so they could tap in all this wealth of indigenous information that is in the peer-reviewed and great literature. And very importantly, we made sure that each chapter had at least one indigenous expert. Yeah, it may be an anthropologist, maybe an indigenous scholar. And the other thing we did, thanks of the expertise in anthropology of our co-chair, Eduardo Brondisio, who's a social anthropologist, we, instead of trying to do we started doing our little focus groups, inviting a bunch of indigenous people and talking about topics we decided. And it didn't go very well. So we took another approach and approached directly the indigenous organizations, right? Not the indigenous people individual, the organization, second level or third level organization, and explain them what we wanted to do and say, can we go to your meetings? You tell us when your meeting is, and you tell us when you give us a slot and how long the slot is going to be, and your methodology for our slot. And we'll discuss issues related with IBES, but in your own terms. And that worked wonderfully because we got invited to, I don't remember how many, but many of these indigenous events. And we had our space for talking. For example, I had to talk about the conceptual framework and people really listened. I remember in many occasions before talking about ecosystem services or talking about biodiversity and people just glazing over, right? And I was used to it. This time, when we started talking about the meaning of this conceptual framework for them, you could see people really looking and really getting engaged. So that was really successful. And the other thing we did was once the drafts were out, we made sure that all the indigenous organizations could have access to them and had the chance to comment and submit comments, and we had to respond. And there were, I think, also a bunch of online consultations, but those don't work very well for indigenous organizations. That's what we did. It's not perfect, it's far from perfect. And of course, the proportion of indigenous knowledge in the global assessment is small with respect to the other knowledge, but I think it's a good start.
I think the second part of Connie's question was also around how these other forms of knowledge could feed into the targets that are very quantitative.
Right. Right. Okay, we had in Kathy's chapter, we had all these indicators of, I think it was essential biodiversity variables that were going up and down. There was a bunch of a compilation of a large number of indigenous indicators of the state and trends of nature. And I think that kind of indicators that are decided by the communities can also be used. And I understand there is a whole task force looking after them, trying to develop them in IBES even further and making sure that they are recorded, they are not quantitative, and they are place-based. That's the problem. They cannot be aggregated at the global level, but they're there.
We'll take a couple more from the audience here. At the back there.
I will probably not hear what she says.
You have to speak loudly as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for your talk. Yeah, I just had two sub questions under the OACM concept because it's been the talk of the town. Can you throw some light on how OACMs are recognized as, private landscapes versus more IPLCs in recognition? Because there are different definitions to us, like private parks being recognized as OACMs versus IPLCs. And my second sub question would be, what is your opinion on how OACMs can be a best bet outside of PAs to reach the Aichi targets?
So it's around, the question was around, I'll just repeat it here, OECMs and how they, could you say again the first question?
Yeah, so I don't think this is working.
That's for the online. Definitely online.
Oh, okay. So basically how they are being recognized, OACMs.
How are OECMs being recognized?
OECMs.
Yeah,
Yes.
because
Elaborate on OECMs?
yeah, in the Indian context, I think most of the OACMs that are recognized are private parks versus indigenous IPLCs. So their private lands mostly private lands are being recognized as OECMs in several places over IPLCs as OECMs. So
OECM.
OECM.
Yes.
it's other effective.
Oh, yes. Right. Yes.
What role they're playing, and so in the Indian context is private parks that are getting recognized in this context as well.
I'm not sure I get to the heart of what you asking. Other area-based protected areas are explicitly recognized in the target that is about protected areas. I think the best of my understanding, but this is, I'm not 100% sure, when they say 30% of the land area or protected, it includes OECMs. So it includes public and private and common collective property areas. That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you. And is that our best bet outside protected areas for reaching the Aichi targets?
Is that our best bet outside protected areas for reaching targets?
I would say that the other area-based protected areas are part of the protected areas. And private protected areas, indigenous protected areas are part of the protected areas target rather than human landscapes. I don't know whether I. Okay, okay, we can talk.
And,
yeah.
One more over here.
Thank you. It's a great presentation, and thanks for all of your contributions throughout your career. I wanted to kind of follow up on Yadvinder's question about climate framework, and I'm curious in the run up to the development of the framework, to what extent there has been thinking about coordination between the implementation strategies and the implementation frameworks, essentially. And I ask for two reasons. One is because I think, you know, there are obviously lots of synergistic, but also some antagonistic strategies and practices between climate and biodiversity. But also it seems like the public and policy motivation around biodiversity has actually declined in the last, I don't know, throughout my career. I hope I'm wrong. I want to be wrong, but it feels as though it's actually less at the front of people's minds and motivations.
Biodiversity. Less than climate.
Well, less than it was two decades ago. And so I'm curious if you, in the putting together of the Kunming Agreement, if there was a conversation about how to sort of build onto or be synergistic with the climate frameworks.
Okay. Among the experts who write the reports on, say, the IPCC reports and the IBES reports and the joint reports, there's a lot of conversation. There's a lot of effort to try to do synergistic things. There was a report in 2020, which was done completely in the pandemic, so completely remotely, which is the first joint report ever between IPCC and IBES, which is all about the synergy, right? How you look after the climate without damaging biodiversity, how by all these nature-based solutions that include biodiversity and climate, it's all about that. And we are all convinced that you cannot help one without the other. They are all the symptoms of the same thing. So you fix them both together or not at all. Having said that, there are two separate conventions with separate institutions, with separate reports. And there's a lot of, how you say, inertia and institutional reluctancy, which I don't understand very well, to actually merge. We all wanted to have just basically joint reports, start working together, not duplicating all the effort. And there is still a lot of resistance. And when you get the negotiators sitting in the plenaries, you get one negotiator in COP15 and a completely different one in the climate COPs. They don't talk each other. And if you, I mean, to be perfectly honest, if you look at the climate bit of the GBF, it's dismaying. It's just there, you know, a minor thing. And if you look at diversity in the IPCC report, it's also not very strong. So just to make a long reply shorter, we need to keep fighting from below to force these structures to merge.
Take one from another one from online from Sally Bailey, who asks ecological integrity and ecosystem function are included in a number of the targets which is great to see. The challenge will be to measure progress in achieving both. And do you have any comments on how we include integrity and function? Yeah. And measure progress in that?
Well, I guess she's meaning what kind of indicators?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, there is this biotic integrity index, which is not absolutely perfect, but seems to be working globally. The problem with that one is you get basically the turnover. You measure how much local abundance of species that used to be there changes and gets in the new situation. And even if you correct for alien species, because you can have the same number and the same abundance all made of alien species, even if you correct for that, the biotic integrity index is not sensitive to what kind of functional protagonist you have there. It doesn't say what is it says about the abundance, it says about the number, but not what sort of, what kind of organ is there. And therefore, it tells you very little about integrity, and it tells you very little about the functioning of the system. I've been told that you can stratify the biotic diversity index by functional type, but I haven't seen it worked in practice. So I would go for that. Yeah.
Okay. I will take a few more. Mikhail at the front. Yeah. No.
I remember there was a workshop in Cambridge where the idea was we need to think up the apex target. And at that meeting, Lockie Harvey was first pushing for his 30-30. And everyone in the room was absolutely convinced this guy is to be ignored. You know, this was such a bad idea. And yet he actually made it then. He convinced so many countries who all fulfilled the criteria already today, formed a coalition, and then it actually became, this is my explanation, and then it became actually a political reality on a global level. And you said in your talk, you know, the one apex target you rejected because it's too simple in a way. However, you know, when we talk about climate targets, it's 1.5, but it's now everyone talks about net zero. And wouldn't have been a formulation like this more beneficial than the one now that everyone is looking at, is the 30%. So couldn't we have been a little smarter on this?
It depends on what you mean by smart. What would be your apex targets? If you had to design the apex targets, the equivalent of 1.5, what would have you?
This was my follow-up question I wanted to ask you. But,
but you said you wouldn't have been smart.
No,
so.
for me, it's actually net positive. And net positive, well, here you need to have a number of indicators, very much with in line with your paper, you know, where you look at genetic all the way to ecosystem. And then the beauty of that one would have been that you can also give this to companies, for example, as a performance indicator. So it's not only, and it would also attack the drivers, because you can only achieve net positive if you really work on the driver's side.
Okay, what would be net positive mean? What you would have to measure to say whether you are going net positive or net negative?
This would be, well, in implementation terms, very similar to what the European Union is currently doing on the taxonomy, where you actually have a lot of activities and you rank them and you actually say this is green, red, or even on a continuous scale. So that this would have been, you know, that's additional work you have to go through, but certainly technically possible.
I mean, one thing is having a rallying cry to say nature positive, which means all the indicators have to go up, or at least not go down. Yeah, but it's a rallying cry, it's an aspiration, it's not a number, right? I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem just going, you know, to the street with positive. But the problem we had is with one number. Yeah, 1.5 degrees is a number, right? So if you are going to have a number for biodiversity, which number would it be? 30% of the planet protected? Okay, it will do something for it, but it doesn't mean you are going to save nature's and its contributions to people in the other 70%. You are not going to save any of the domestic genetic diversity with this 30% of intact ecosystems. You don't necessarily are going to look after all the threatened species. So one number in one, or for example, imagine the target, there was this point in which the apex target could be reduce the extinction rate by, I don't know, tenfold or something. So using species as the apex targets, but then again, it doesn't really encapsulate anything. So because of its biodiversity is diverse, you would need a bunch of apex targets. That's why it doesn't work. And I think, to be honest, I think that the force of the apex targets like 1.5 and everything have a lot to do with the communication and lobbying capacity rather than with the science behind them. I'm not saying it doesn't have the science, but they get so far because of extremely good lobbying and communication skill. My opinion, anyway.
We'll take a couple more, just two more, I think we'll finish in the middle there.
Speak loudly.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you so much for the talk. Very
Speak loudly.
okay. Yeah, I'm saying thank you so much for the talk. It's really interesting to hear this. But my question, I guess, is just to understand on the delivery part. And are we only going to rely on what the countries are going to be reporting every, I don't know, 5 years to say we are doing well or we are going toward a certain progress? Or we actually thought about a system of monitoring on a yearly basis that could be somehow independent and could actually inform if we are making a progress or if we are stagnating?
Thank you. Yeah, I did. I think that how often we monitor is being discussed as we speak. Of course, the countries, the obligation of the countries is every, I don't remember how many years, but I would say probably twice in the next 10 years, they have all these, what is called national communications, which is a country report in which the country says, it's like a tick box system in which the country says whether the different targets have been achieved or not, whether it's progress, not progress, whatever. I think that is going to happen, but to me, it's highly unsatisfactory. I think we do need to find monitoring systems that are monitored every year. We don't want to come to the situation in which year 9, we discovered we haven't done enough, right? Like happened with the Aichi targets. It was a death foretold. We all knew that they were all going to fail, but we didn't declare officially failed until the Aichi targets expired. So we don't want that. But to be very honest, the detailed monitoring will not depend only on the will of the countries. I think that the community, whatever the community is, academics, the universities, the big NGOs, the small NGOs are the ones who have to watch and not let policymakers get away with not doing a good job.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't.
Hi, it's always fantastic to hear how a scientist navigates a negotiation and diplomatic process. Is there any new skill that you develop as a scientist, as being part of this diplomatic process? And what would be your message for early career researchers that would like to become international scientists and navigate between the science and the diplomatic world? And also, if you can share with us, how was your relation with the Argentinian government in terms of diplomatic training, or any other government or UN agency in this process? Because I guess it was very important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, my role was absolutely as an expert. In order to be having a voice, not a voice, having a say in plenary, raising your hand whenever you want and having a say, and in order to vote, you had to be an official country representative. The official country representative is typically not a scientist. It may be an ex-scientist, it may be an ex-officio scientist, but at least in my area of the world, is most commonly a diplomat, usually a lawyer, right? Which they know a lot about law. Some of them also know biology, but many of them don't understand biology. So it's a challenge to explain them why extinction rate and extinction risk are different things, for example. But anyway, so I've never been involved in the diplomatic body of my country or any other country. So my role was to write the scientific reports or coordinate many people who wrote them, which is purely a scientific work. We don't do primary science in those reports. We do an effort of synthesis. Actually, you are not allowed to do primary science. You have to rely on published data because it has happened, it has survived the first layer of scrutiny. As a junior scientist who wants to get involved, I would say do get involved, because there's a lot of need for people who understand the science to get into the process. The GBF, I want to believe that the GBF would have been much worse if a bunch of scientists wasn't there just pushing and trying. And one important role we have, it's a bit pathetic, but it's important, is in all these big meetings, all the delegates of the countries are there discussing. You are not allowed to speak. You are not allowed to publicly say anything, but you can capture them in the corridors, right? And propose things to them and explain and criticize. And sometimes they would quickly consult you because they have a doubt and they know you are a reliable resource. So you are there as a pathetic resource in the corridor to be used by them. But it ends up being really powerful, really influential. And that's why all these COPs happen in person. That's why it didn't happen in 2020 remotely, because most of the action doesn't happen in the plenary room. So my advice would be, yes, it's good to involve from time to time. It's hugely educational. Also, I have to say, takes a huge amount of your time. So if you do it too junior, maybe it's not the best career choice. So I've had to balance that, I would say.
I think that's a lovely question to finish on. And I think just personally, your leadership and inspiration in driving through the science all the way through the IPBES framework and then on to the CBT has been an exemplary, I think, and a role model to many people, whether early career or late career, in terms of that engagement between science and global policy. So thank you for your leadership there. Thank you for your presentation today. And you deserve a glass of wine. Everybody's welcome to join us for a glass of wine in the reception just around the corner.
Thank you for your excellent and challenging question.